can do that from here. It's okay. Thank you for the kind welcome and for the invitation. Thank you all for coming. Good morning. What I'm going to present to you today, and I probably shouldn't speak for very long. I'll try and go through this fairly rapidly so that we can have more discussion after that, is based on some fairly, I guess, obvious observations on the nature of the field, which I've been involved in for quite a while, and thinking kind of in terms of the methodologies that we use, and what I think has gone wrong with those, and how we might try and move beyond that. So what I will do is I will start with some observations on dominant trends within the study of Islam that we see in the metropolitan academia. I will then consider three fairly well-known and recent critiques of those sorts of practices that have been published in the last few years. Some of them have caused quite a stir. And then I will finish with some of my own observations of the sorts of things that we might want to think about moving forward, and what sorts of theoretical frameworks we might consider moving forward as well. I think it's extremely important that we reflect on how we study things. We reflect on the basic question, I guess, which I will not necessarily address today, which is whether Islamic studies is actually a discipline, because there's some who would doubt that it is actually a discipline, or more that it's an area of study which brings to it different types of disciplines, and what, in a sense, constitutes the unity of something that we might call Islamic studies. So the first point to begin with is a fairly obvious one, and that is Orientalism. I'm sure most of you are familiar with Orientalism. The aspects of Orientalism which I'm interested in here is how Orientalism has a focus upon defining entities in an essential manner, with a stress upon what you might call linguistic reductionism, textual reductionism. By this I mean that Islam is then represented by texts, by certain hegemonic privileged texts. So, for example, if one wants to understand what Islam is, then classically one turns to the Quran and only to the Quran. One doesn't even necessarily express an interest in how that Quranic text has been received by Muslims historically in different ways, nor ways in which that text is actually used. So it's primarily what I mean here by Orientalism, and I'm not focusing especially on the political aspects, or the political aspects are important, but rather the notion of textual reductionism, the Quranic centrism, Qurano-centrism of it, the Arabic centrism, so it's all about defining Islam in terms of the Arabic language and what is expressed in the Arabic language, and a privileging of the legal tradition, so what you might also call nomocentrism. Sorry, I just realized I haven't. Yeah, that might help. Nomocentrism involved in that, and also a reflection upon Islam and the texts of Islam from this sort of European gaze. So Islam is what exists in the texts. There is very little interest in what those who profess Islam and Muslims necessarily think. And this can lead to some quite bizarre situations in which you have Orientalists basically telling Muslims what they should be believing and what they should not be believing, and telling Muslims and Arabs what the Quran actually means. So in the most absurd examples, saying that the Quran is basically a text which is a second-hand Syriac lectionary, in the famous examples of some later, more recent German Orientalism, and talking about the Arabic mistakes in the Quran, because of course an academic sitting in Oxford and Princeton knows Arabic better than Arabs do. So there are all sorts of kind of issues which are involved in this complex that we are calling Orientalism, and it has gone an extensive critique insofar as it relates to the study of Islam. There, of course, are plenty of people who still profess these sorts of attitudes. They still exist in places like Oxford, places like Princeton, places, of course, like Leiden. But increasingly, with new generations of students coming through and younger academics who are coming through who are aware of the sorts of power differentials which are involved in these sorts of discourses, it's open to critique. So it's something which is increasingly being contested. There are elements of that which relate to what sort of methodological practice does this sort of study of Islam involve, and this is where I'm talking about this conflict between history, the study of Islam as a historical study, as opposed to kind of Arabic linguistic reductionism. So there's a very famous debate going back to the late 80s or so between those who considered themselves to be proficient in Arabic and understanding Arabic texts, and saying that we need to take the texts at face value. Famously, Sajjad, who was a professor of Arabic at Cambridge at the time, and those who considered what they were doing as history of religion, particularly, of course, Michael Cook, who's now at Princeton, and the late Patricia Kroner. So this was considered to be very much a conflict between history and what they called Arabiya, the study of Arabic and Arabic linguistics. And then, since then, of course, we've also had a number of other developing approaches to the study of Islam, particularly within two fields. One is religious studies, and the other one is anthropology. In religious studies, you've had the development of what is sometimes called the history of religions approach. So one takes the study of the development of Islam, Islamic origins and beyond, as a particular kind of case study, in the same way that one would study the history of the development of Judaism, Christianity, and other religions. It's a historical, critical approach. It's avowedly secular. And one of the elements of it is this notion of debunking established traditional internal religious narratives. So a good example of this is someone like Bruce Lincoln, who is at the University of Chicago, for whom the study of religion has to come from a secular perspective, because it's only that secular perspective which can be which can act as a critique of a hegemonic religious internal perspective on that particular tradition. Alongside that, you've got the development of internal forms of what I would call confessionalism, and some people get offended by the term. I think it's not necessarily a bad way of looking at it. And this is people who have been hired increasingly in religion departments in North America, who basically are Muslims. And it's almost as if they're being hired because they are native informants, who can then tell people what they profess, and then can train and teach their students from that particular perspective. And so it's a sense in which they are engaging in their own theological practice and trying to locate the study of Islam within a comparative theological context. So these two perspectives within the study of religion, the history of religions approach and a more confessional comparative theology approach, seem to be very much at loggerheads. And I'll come back to a very good example of this clash, which happened quite recently between two specialists. One is Aaron Hughes, and the other one is Omid Safi in the States a few years ago within the context of the American Academy of Religion. And then, of course, the other main disciplinary context in which we've had this is the sort of debates which one finds in this anthropology and sociology. We've, of course, got Talal Asad's very influential approach to Islam as a discursive tradition, and looking at how one might consider the unity of what we study with respect to Islam in terms of his conception of a discursive tradition, which is associated, of course, with text, but of course also with the interpretative practices associated with the text. And at the other side, you've also got the anthropological approaches, which are perhaps less interested in text as something inscribed and written down, but more interested in what people actually do. And so you get the sort of notion that I've put down here, which is there are as many Islams as situations that sustain it. This is, of course, a very famous opening sentence of a book by Aziz al-Azmeh called Islams and Modernities. The kind of slightly ironic thing about that opening sentence of that book is that this is definitely not something that Aziz professes. Aziz is not a pluralist when it comes to these sorts of things. In fact, he's an old-fashioned, what I would describe as a French intellectual, style secular intellectual who is more interested in how you unify a sense of what Islam might mean in modernity as opposed to pluralize it. So these are some examples of what are going on at the moment. I mean, I'm sure you can think of many more. I'm not that familiar with how the study of Islam works within this particular region, within the Malay world, but maybe this is something we can discuss and see how it relates to the snapshot which I'm presenting here of three types of approaches: Orientalism, the study of religion approach, and anthropology. And here you have an example of some of the text which I'm talking about, Talal Asad's. Incidentally, this article, The Idea of an Anthropology of Islam, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, is, I think, still an extremely significant piece which is worth engaging with. Of course, you've got Edward Said's Orientalism, classic first edition. You've got Hagarism by Patricia Kroner and Michael Cook, in which they famously say that this is a book written by infidels for infidels, which kind of tells you something about the sort of attitude of iconoclasm involved in there. And then you've got, I think, what I think is still an excellent book, which many more people should really be reading, which is Talal Asad's Genealogies of Religion, which really comes to grips with one of the fundamental things in the study of religion, which is basically how it is that we need to understand where this category of religion comes from, and how we need to understand the European philosophical background to making sense of this category of religion. Now, coming to critiques, and I'm going to mention three critiques. Two of them are internal, one of them is external. Arguably, the third one is not even external, and that's Aaron Hughes, but I'll come back to that in a second. I'm going to start with the first one because this is perhaps the most recent one. Keisha Ali, I don't know how many people are familiar with Keisha Ali. She's at Boston University, probably one of the most prominent Muslim feminist academics around. Certainly, you could argue the most prominent Muslim woman in the study of Islam. Since Amna Wadud is basically retired now and she's not that active. She's written extensively. Perhaps her most important work is a work called Sexual Ethics in Islam. And she's been engaged primarily with issues around gender. Now, recently she's written this piece, The Omnipresent Male Scholar, which is a critique of how Islamic studies works, but also how it is that Islamic knowledge is formed and produced amongst Muslims, and the role of the kind of the Muslim male academic, and also, like you could say, the Muslim male sheikh or religious leader. It's worth reading. I think the actual article of hers is almost definitely on her academia page. If you Google it, you'll definitely find the article. It was published in a journal which comes out of London called Critical Muslim. And it's basically a critique of how it is that we tend to study Islam by privileging the male voice and the male gaze, by asserting and entrenching the authority of the male scholar. And she gives a few examples of this. Her examples are Sherman Jackson, who is a very prominent professor of Islamic Studies in the University of California, and the other example she gives is Muhammad Qasim Zaman, who is a professor of Islamic Studies at Princeton. And how it is that the study of Islam has not really gone beyond the structures of patriarchy which have existed in the pre-modern period, but have been further entrenched in the modern study of Islam. And so one of the things that she suggests, there's two things she suggests in particular. One is this notion of provincializing men. If you're familiar with the work of Dipesh Chakrabarti, who's at the University of Chicago, something like, I think it came out in 2000, he has a book called Provincializing Europe, which is all about how we need to critique the study of the humanities, in particular of philosophy, bringing in the wider world. This is the globalized aspect of what I've been talking about, by provincializing Europe, understanding that Europe is a certain space and a certain point in intellectual history, which has become privileged for all sorts of political, historical reasons. But it would be really useful if we understand that in the widest sort of scope and course of history, it has been a particular moment. And so one needs to use the internal resources of the European philosophical traditions. In particular, he uses Heidegger to understand how Europe, in a sense, has been quite marginal. Certainly, Enlightenment discourses about Europe have been quite marginal. And seeing how it is that we can bring back the contributions of Indian and Chinese and African and other types of philosophies and epistemologies and rationalities into our contemporary way of looking at the world and studying the humanities. So in a sense, I think one of the points which is quite important to understand is that this debate about what the study of Islam is today and the study of what Islamic studies is today is very much linked in a wider sort of debate about what sort of humanities that we want to be studying and what we want to be teaching our students, and how that sense of humanities, that sense of the liberal arts and liberal studies can go beyond a certain narrow Eurocentric confine of reading sort of great books by sort of dead white males, as it's classically been put. And so for the other aspect of what Keisha is suggesting is that we really need to have an epistemological turn in the study of Islam. We need to see how it is that knowledge is understood, knowledge is formed, knowledge is produced within these contexts, which are not necessarily just the traditional ones of the realm of the ulama, but also the realm of academic Islamic studies. Of course, Keisha's work has had some pushback. Recently there was one response by one of the people that she targeted, which is Sherman Jackson, but again, I leave that for you to go off and you can have a look online. You'll find Sherman Jackson's response, and there's been quite a lot of debate on Twitter and on Facebook and other social media about it. At one level, one of the things that has happened, which I think is unfair, extremely unfair on Keisha Ali, is the suggestion that she's only interested in statistics. So people have said she's only interested in looking at reading lists and bibliographies and seeing what percentage of those reading lists and bibliographies are made up of male authors and which ones are made up of female authors. That's really not the point. Obviously, we know that most of those bibliographies and reading lists are primarily made up of male authors, sometimes overwhelmingly so. But her point is more how those voices are used. You can still have a reading list, you can still have a bibliography which is primarily male, and yet still critically engage with that bibliography and those sources, and bring in other types of voices within it. Recently, a friend of mine who is probably the most prominent Catholic theologian in Britain, Gavin da Costa, at the University of Bristol, he's an old friend and colleague, told me that at Bristol they had been asked in the humanities and social sciences to look at their reading lists and to see how it is that they can basically decolonize those reading lists and consider what sorts of balances they have in their reading lists between male and female authors, and also authors of color. And he said this is interesting because, of course, for him, as someone who works in theology and religious studies, this is something that they've been quite concerned with for quite a while. Within the study of Catholicism or Christianity, how does one bring in women's voices, but also how does one bring in voices from Africa and from other places which have been considered traditionally marginal to the study of theology. The second critique I want to quickly mention is Aaron Hughes. And these are the two books, particularly of Aaron Hughes, Theorizing Islam and Situating Islam. And his point is that Islamic studies as a field, and if it is a field, is insufficiently theorized. And what he's interested is the question I put at the beginning, which is, what has the study of Islam contributed to the study of religion? And his point is that actually, in practice, most people in Islamic studies have not contributed anything to the study of religion. What he means by that is that if you place the study of Islam within the study of religion, it is a particular case study. And as a case study, you want to be able to derive certain principles and concepts which you can then see whether they apply to other traditions and how they work within a comparative framework. And there are a number of reasons why he thinks this has happened. Incidentally, I should mention that Aaron Hughes is a professor of Jewish studies and of Islamic studies. What a lot of people don't know is that he has a mixed background. So he is very much Jewish, but he also has, on his maternal side, he has a Lebanese Shi'i background. And so people often attack him for being an outsider, but in a sense he is not an outsider, because he certainly is someone who has an Islamic background as well. Although I don't want to make this a question of an ad hominem issue, it's not really about who the person is as such. So one of the things he says, Islam is not sui generis. If we're going to say it's a religion and understand how the concept of religion develops, particularly about how the concept of a world religion develops, then we need to locate the study of Islam, particularly the origins and development of Islam within that. We need to think about how this concept of religion is constructed and how it's given meaning in modern kind of post-Christian context. And one work that he discusses in particular is the work of Brent Nongbury. I don't know how many people are familiar with him, but he has a work which was published, I think about 4 or 5 years ago, which is about how the concept of religion develops. One of the funny things about Brent Nongbury's work, and this tells you something about an element of the parochialism of religious studies in the US, is that Nongbury is almost exactly making the same argument that Talal Asad made 20-odd years ago, and almost completely fails to mention Asad, which I think again tells you something about how certain types of discourses are privileged within American academia. The point he's making is exactly the same as Asad's about how religion is a constructed category which arises out of the philosophical traditions of Europe. And the second point, in a sense, that Hughes makes is that a lot of the study of Islam is affected by the modern ghosts of what he calls neo-Orientalism, and this affects both those who defend the faith and also attack it, based on precisely the sort of reductionist forms of Orientalism that I was discussing earlier, but in a new form. And then he looks at 2 types of things which are done in the 2 works. In the situating work, he looks at how it is that the context of how we study Islam is important. So whether that was a pre-9/11 context or a post-9/11 context, whether you've got this abiding influence of German Orientalism, and also this question about whether one approaches the study of Islam from what's known as an area studies sort of approach, a Middle East studies approach, or whether it's done within theology and religious studies. and they seem to be quite distinct, and you can see that certainly in practices within North America, where people who do Islamic studies in NELC departments often will not even be speaking the same language, and certainly will not be engaging with those who do the study of Islam in religion departments. And so what's required to go beyond that, which is the theorizing one, is to deconstruct how the study of Islam has worked and be aware of what he thinks is the biggest threat to the abiding sustainability of Islamic studies, which is apologetics. He argues that a lot of describes as Islamic religious studies, which I previously called confessionalism, has become, as he puts it, the site of liberal Muslim theologizing. So a lot of Muslim academics who are in religious studies departments are basically liberal Muslims who are kind of apologizing for Islam and sort of saying, no, Islam is fine with this, that, and the other, which is usually a set of liberal, European liberal values. So everything from sexualities and gender relations all the way through to interfaith and far beyond. Now, one of the, and in that work in particular, he really attacks the study of Islam group within the American Academy of Religion as exemplifying this particular tendency. This, of course, led to an argument with Umaid Safi. Umaid Safi is a professor of Islamic studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and Safi basically accuses Hughes of being kind of a neo-Orientalist. Hughes accuses Safi as being a Muslim apologist. So it's kind of like a dialogue of the deaf between the two. But in some ways, if you read some of those exchanges between Hughes and Safi, which you can find online, this was raging about 3 years ago, including on the AAR's Study of Islam listserv, you get a sense of where that sort of debate is between the study, the insistence that you need to study Islam as you'd study any religion in a historical, critical manner, and the other side saying, no, the study of Islam has to engage with power differentials and has to really be sensitive to what Muslims actually profess and do. And in a sense, that there's a way in which it's perhaps a bit too unfair to pit the two together, because on the one hand, Umaid Safi is not exactly against a historical critical approach, and on the other hand, Hughes is perfectly aware that the political context of studying Islam in a post-9/11 world is quite difficult for most Muslim academics to have to negotiate. The third one is a work which, to a large extent, has been massively celebrated since it came out a few years ago. And this is this book by Shahab Ahmed called What is Islam? It's not really about what is Islam. What's more important is the subtitle, which is called The Importance of Being Islamic. Now, there have been conferences and articles and long reviews written on it. One of the ones which I might mention to you is something I was involved in. There's this thing called the Marginalia Review of Books, which is online, and there was a forum on the book which came out about 2 years or so ago, in which each of us was asked to critically review one of the chapters of the book, and there was a kind of a conversation between us. So what he does in the book is the first part is kind of a critique of how people study Islam, along the lines of things that I've mentioned and a number of people have talked about, how it's very much focused on defining Islam through the text, particularly through the Quran, through Arabic, defining Islam through law, privileging of law over, for example, literature and philosophy. And he asks, in particular in the introduction, 6 types of questions about whether things are Islamic. So, one of the questions he asks is drinking wine Islamic? And we can maybe come back to that, what he means by that. Another question he asks is, we know that the Divan of Hafiz is arguably one of the most important works of Muslim cultures after the Quran. And so why is the reading of the Divan-e-Hafiz, using the Divan-e-Hafiz for all sorts of ways? For example, very recently, if you might not be familiar with this, but on the winter solstice, the 21st of December, the Iranians celebrate what is known as Shab-e Yalda. And Yalda, leaving aside what it actually originally means, it probably means Christmas, but we'll leave that aside. One of the practices people do is they take the Divan-e-Hafiz and they open the page, and it's known as a fal, where you pick out at random a ghazal of Hafiz and you read it, and this is supposed to tell you your future for the next year. Of course, with any of these kind of practices, you read into it what you will. Most ghazals, as I'm sure you know, poetry can be very ambiguous, and good poetry is always like a mirror. You see yourself within it, just in the same way that when you open the Quran, you always see yourself within it when you pick out a verse. You have similar kinds of processes of people using the Quran in that way. So he raises these 6 questions. What he's also doing is he's kind of decentering the Arabic, the privileging of the Arabic tradition. And he's talking about how most of the study of Islam, most of the historical experience of being Islamic is within what he calls the Balkans to Bengal complex. This is the central area. And this is one which goes far beyond just the Arabic speak space. For other people, this is basically what we describe as the Persianate. But we can come back to that later. And part of it is about decentering the textual nomocentric. He also engages in a critique which shows that he doesn't really quite understand what Asad is about. And he's interested in what I have here as my third point, which is reinvigorating what he calls the mazhab-e-ishq, the doctrine, the path of love. Reintroducing the arts and literatures is absolutely central to Islam, the Islamic experience, and reintroducing philosophy and humanity. So, for example, he has a lot to say about how Ibn Arabi, Sohrawardi, Mullah Sadra, Avicenna are very important for Islamic civilization over time. There's another point he has about the nature of hermeneutics, but I'll leave that because it's a bit more technical, and I actually have a critique of that in the Marginalia review, which I mentioned earlier, which you can, of course, look at, and I can give you the reference to that. So these are 3 recent critiques which I think give us a sense of where things are going within a self-reflective approach to what it is that we do in Islamic studies. Now, as I move forward, I want to just say something. I don't think it necessarily needs to be so heavily argued, because for me this is fairly obvious if one is not going to be a narrow or sort of Eurocentrist. And this is the need for a more globalized and decolonized approach. And as I said, I locate this within a wider rethinking of how we conceive of the humanities. One of the things which I think would be really great is if people thought in terms of what happens is that we nowadays, when we look at the disciplines that were studied in, for example, the madaris classically, we refer to them as the Islamic sciences. And we use the word science not just because the word used classically is ulum, and in modern linguistic usage, ilm means science, but because science as a form of knowledge, of presenting knowledge, is very much privileged in the modern world. Maybe we should actually be looking at these traditions as humanities. Because when you look at what was going on in the madaris, they were very much about formation of character. Ethics was a very important element of that, the akhlaq tradition. And the sort of training that was involved was not a straightforwardly scientific, exact training. Of course, there were exact sciences which were part of that training, but the primary training was about what it means to be human and how you develop your humanity, how you communicate that humanity, how you deal with others. And so it would be really useful, actually, if we thought in terms of Islamic humanities. And I'm saying this partly because of my former colleague and Rushdan's former supervisor, James Morris, who is at Boston College in the States. Jim used to teach a class at Exeter called Introduction to the Islamic Humanities, which is a wonderful class. I ended up taking that over, in which what we did was we introduced first-year students to some of the classic texts of the Islamic traditions and how it is that those texts then convey to students precisely this issue of what was a humanity, what was the study of the human and of becoming human all about. And so in that, the sort of text that we study, of course, we started with Quranic material, we looked at hadith material, but also we looked at things from the akhlaq tradition, we looked, of course, at Rumi's Masnavi, we looked at Hafiz, and we looked at the Mantiq al-Tayr of Attar. So it was very much about looking at and there was also, there'd be a session or so on Islamic art and architecture. So it's looking at basically how it is that the arts and culture are then expressed and how they have this gearing towards the question of humanity. So I think that should be the broader frame in which we're looking at these things. And so there's partly these sorts of things which I've already mentioned. Provincializing Europe, looking at the state of modernity and what that entails and allows. Decentering master narratives such as Orientalism. Looking at the post-colony and post-coloniality as a state of mind and not just a historical point, a point in history or a particular space. And reading for liberation, which allows one to reinsert or insert voices back from subalternity. And that's why the issue of gender, of intersectionality and so forth is quite important. So this is the broader kind of context in which I think we should be doing this and working this through. And my final kind of slide is to just kind of reiterate what I think some of these particular issues are and what decolonization should look like. So I guess basically what I'm saying is that if one looks at the question of Islamic studies within the globalized world, one begins with a critique and one moves towards what I call the active decolonization of that field of study and its curricula. And so these are some of the points which I'm making, which we can come up. One is thinking about theoretical frameworks and how we construct theoretical frameworks which are internal. One of the critiques which I often make of the study of religion in the US is that they are kind of obsessed with theoretical frameworks. So they're obsessed with, how do you use Charles Peirce, how do you use Foucault, how do you use Ricoeur, how do you use Derrida to study religion? And they don't necessarily consider whether there are resources within religious traditions which can be used to construct a theoretical framework. One simple example could be, if you're looking at Ibn Arabi, then why don't you consider some of the concepts which are internal to him, like how it is that he uses language to construct a form of literalist, but rather radically deconstructionist readings of the text. How it is that he uses the concepts of taqeed in the way in which we use language, but also in the way in which you consider practices and so forth. And how, in a sense, taqeed is not necessarily the same thing that we talk about in Western philosophy when we talk about reification. One example. The second point I'm making is multiply discourses. One of the fundamental problems, I think, in the study of Islam is this privileging of what I describe as Sunni, or increasingly I'll put in brackets Salafi normativity. So that defines what Islam is and what the Islamic tradition is. And then we need to really understand that when it comes to the study of Islam, we're looking at lots of different traditions which are claiming to make sense of Islam for themselves. And so all of those traditions are very much part of the intellectual heritage, and all of those have to be engaged. There's much to be learnt from those different ones. And also, one has to recognize that when we look at classical texts, they are all engaging with each other. I'll give you two simple examples. In the study of theology, philosophical theology, the two most important texts, arguably, are the Tajrid al-I'tiqad of Nasiruddin Tusi, who of course was a 13th century Shi'i, 12th Shi'i thinker. And the other one is the Mawaqif of Iji, who is a 14th century Sunni Ash'ari thinker. Now, these texts have a number of commentaries. They have shuruh, and they also have many hawashi and so forth. And these works were written by people from all different traditions, and they often engaged in some core theoretical points. So, for example, there's a lot of discussion of metaphysics, of what they called umur amma. In both of them, there's also discussions about how you prove and establish the existence of God. And, of course, there are also other issues in theology about how one understands things like the infallibility or inerrancy of prophets, about the nature of leadership, the afterlife, and so forth. But this was a common language. There were these core texts which people from different traditions engaged with. So you've got, Zaydis from Yemen engaging with these texts. You've got later Ash'aris. You've got Ash'aris who are heavily influenced by Avicenna engaging with and others and so forth. So we need to really think about how these different discourses are then used in the study of Islam, and then how we then consider it in the contemporary period as well. We need to look at text as well as context and lived experience. The study of Islam cannot just be about texts which are just historical and in the past. Obviously, the Quran is a privileged text, both intellectually and also in terms of practice. But part of the element is looking at then how it is that one deals with this text as an artifact, as something which should be glossed and understood, in also the very many different languages. The other point I make, for example, is take other languages seriously. The study of Islam cannot just be about Arabic. I think if one is, for example, hiring someone in Islamic studies, then one's almost got to insist that they have training in at least 2 different linguistic traditions. Arabic, of course, I think should be one of those, but there should be much more. There's Turkish, there's Persian, there's Urdu, there's Malay, there's many others out there which are very much part of the development of that tradition. We've got to take gender and intersectionality quite seriously. So it should not just be about perpetuating patriarchal structures and patriarchal intellectual approaches to the study of religion, but taking the subaltern much more seriously. And the final point I'll make is the one I made earlier, which is about the Islamic humanities. Really think about how it is that we can form the Islamic humanities. Those of you who may be at the point where you're really thinking about curricula and what the study of Islam should be, I think should engage much more with this. I have colleagues who are doing liberal studies and thinking about what the Islamic humanities or Islamic liberal arts might be in the contemporary world, particularly in non-European, non-North American contexts. And this is a very important way to rethink these sorts of issues. How it is that the resources, the intellectual traditions, with the spiritual traditions within Islam are used to engage with this question of what it means to be human. And in many ways, even the classic kind of European notion of the humanities is precisely that. You train people because you want them to be a certain type of person. Someone who's reflective and thinking about who they are, where they are, how they engage with others, where they're coming from, where they're going to. And I think I'll stop at that point. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Associate Professor, for the, I think, very fruitful discussion and kind of opened our eyes for a new thing. For us to think about. All right, for this, we still have time. So I'll open for Q&A session. We can throw questions to the speakers. So please, if you can state your name and if is it your department or from faculty you're from, and then hope the question will be concise and precise then. So please, I will open the floor for Q&A. Any question? There's supposed to be mic.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Farid Alatas from Department of Sociology and Department of Malay Studies, National University of Singapore. So I am obviously, maybe not obvious to you, but I'm obviously sympathetic with what you are saying. I think I could say that I work in a similar area but in a way, in a reverse process. I begin with a tradition like Ibn Khaldun and develop certain arguments, arguing that one should think from within the categories and concepts that he uses, and so on and so forth. So I very much agree with what you're saying. But I have just a couple of questions. The first one relates to your distinction between different types of discourses or traditions. You speak about the Orientalist tradition, and then you speak about the history of Islam, the historical tradition. What's the basis of your classification? The reason I'm asking is because if you're saying that one is Orientalist, but the other, the historical study, is also Orientalist, maybe not in a textualist sense, but in other senses. For example, the marginalization of local concepts and ideas. You may study Ibn Khaldun, you may engage in historical tradition, but you consider Ibn Khaldun as an object of study rather than as a subject, as a knowing subject. That's also Orientalist, but not in a textualist way. So that's one question. The other question, you mentioned 3 critiques, and I agree with that these are relevant critiques. That these critiques are out there, and obviously you're not saying that these are the only critiques. But I'm just curious to know what you would say about other critiques that may single out the secularist predisposition of much of Islamic studies in the West. There are also several critiques that focus more on the issue of Eurocentrism, and the critique that surrounds the whole issue of Islamization of knowledge. I know what you would think about that. Yeah, and my last point is this. I very much agree with this, your characterization of what decolonial knowledge or decolonized Islamic studies would look like. But the problem is, in a different way, critiques 30, 40 years ago were saying, well, if you would just take one aspect of this, looking at taking tradition seriously. So the proponents of Islamization of knowledge talked about tradition, but until today they are still talking about the tradition rather than actually working from within the tradition. So you can talk about Ibn Khaldun, you can talk about Mullah Sadra, I'm not referring to you, of course, you can talk about Ibn Rushd and so on. You continue talking about them rather than doing philosophy, rather than doing sociology through the ideas. So one needs to get out of that critique and actually do the work itself. Yeah. Thank you.
Just on the last point first, this reminds me of, I have a good friend who's a philosopher at the American University of Beirut, and he always says to me, Sajjad, when are you going to stop doing exegetical work and when you're actually going to do proper philosophy? Yeah, Nadal al-Bizri, exactly. And I kind of see his point because he's very much engaged in what philosophy is today, and he writes a lot in Arabic, which I think is important because this is, again, one of the problems, I think, about Islamic studies and the humanities is that we basically just, we don't think about different types of audiences. So, for example, people in Pakistan, on the whole, do not write in Urdu about philosophy. There are a couple of famous people who give lectures, but and even then, no one really listens to them. There's more of a tradition of writing about these things in Turkish and Persian, in Turkey and Iran. But broadly speaking, there's not as much kind of attempts to articulate what these things like Islamic humanities means within different linguistic traditions beyond the English. So, it goes back to the classic old, one of the internal critiques of Said is that he is kind of Anglo and Eurocentric in himself because he's only interested in how it is that one can then critique Orientalism, but very much in kind of an English idiom. And that he himself, for example, came to expressing his ideas in Arabic very late in his life. So I think that's well taken. On your first point about Orientalism, I wasn't actually, maybe that was my fault for not being clear. What I wanted to start with Orientalism was to say that this, in many ways, permeates the way in which the field was, and to a certain extent continues to be. But the two ways in which, or the three ways in which it's really developing now is in the study of religion areas and in the anthropological, more sort of social science areas, and how those are the two disciplinary formations which, in a sense, are opposed to each other in the study of Islam. But both of them also do continue to manifest some of the elements of Orientalism, which is well established before that, such as the privileging of the text and so forth. Your second point, which I'm now forgetting. The other critiques, yes. So, yes, I agree with you. I mean, there's the Islamization of knowledge I'm going to leave for others. I have issues with that because any sort of critique and discourse has its own political context. The development of, the Islamization of knowledge basically out of the Muslim Brotherhood is something which is well known, and also the way in which it's being engaged in the last 10 odd years in Iran has its own politics, although it has a longer tradition in Iran as well. I'm not too concerned with that because I agree a lot of it has been about arguing about whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. In practice, in many cases, what has happened is that it's established departments, or in certain cases closed university departments. And whether it's actually produced knowledge, I think, is an open question. Of course, there are the critiques, including the ones which decenter secularism. So one of the kind of ironies of someone like Dipesh Chakrabarti, really interesting provincializing Europe, is that he almost exclusively uses European thinking to provincialize Europe. And it kind of begs the question of, to what extent is Heidegger particular or universal? Interestingly, I recently saw that there's a volume coming out on Heidegger and the Muslim world in a couple of months, which should be quite interesting, which is looking at how it is that Heidegger has been received in Arabic and Persian and other languages and philosophical traditions. But this question about, the point I was trying to make about Ibn Arabi, there are many other examples. Why not use internal concepts? The person I worked on, Mullah Sadra, some of his key philosophical ideas, which I've also suggested as a type of hermeneutics, some of these are not straightforwardly. You can find calques and parallels for them in Aristotle and the Neoplatonic tradition, but they're not identical. So you take something like his concept of Tashkik al-Wujud. Tashkik al-Wujud is notoriously difficult to translate into English because there is no existing concept. It's not as straightforward as as some people would say pros-hen equivocation in the late antique tradition, or it's not necessarily the same as Thomas's analogy and so forth with respect to looking at ontology. There are many other things going on there. And then it's a question of, how do you look at someone like Ibn Arabi? There's some people recently who are trying to argue that Ibn Arabi is a philosopher. Well, that might be problematic. Even when we look at people that we want to describe as philosophers in the tradition, again, I go back to what my friend Nadil Bizri once said to me. He said, maybe in some contexts, if we describe a thinker in the Islamic tradition as a philosopher, instead of actually privileging and celebrating him, maybe we're actually diminishing him. Because all you're doing with someone who actually has contributions in many different fields is you're reducing them to one particular field. And in most cases, these people were much more than philosophers. They were much more than theologians. They were much more than jurists. They were much more than Sufis or poets and so forth. And so sometimes actually the use of category, such as philosophy or theology or whatever, may be diminishing and restricting the contributions that a person has within a field. And so, we do need to think about how we do it. And absolutely, I agree with you. I mean, the fundamental thing has to be to do the creative work. My classic disclaimer is I'm a historian, right? So when people ask me about, this particular idea in Mullah Sadra or Avicenna, and I say, well, I explain it and I can kind of understand it and analyze it, but I'm an intellectual historian. There are people out there who should be doing the creative, philosophical stuff. Sometimes I kind of have to step into that breach because people don't want to do that. So increasingly, I do that in theology. So I've done a lot of comparative theology work, engaging with Christians and others, on themes, whether that's monotheism, whether that's kind of love, whether that's mercy, justice, or whatever. And that's because I think we should be doing that sort of thing, because we don't have, on the whole, the sorts of public intellectuals who engage in that comparative context. A colleague of mine has a project on, for example, on gratitude in the theology department, Divinity School at Edinburgh. And she was really struggling to find Muslims to engage with that sort of dialogue. And I was thinking, why would it be difficult? I mean, gratitude is like such an obvious thing in a Muslim context. It should not be difficult to find someone who can speak coherently and theologically about what gratitude means in their particular tradition. And I think that part of it is, for some people, there is a reticence, and I admit that when I say I'm a historian, sometimes that sounds like a bit of a cop-out. I have other colleagues who will use that to basically hide and not engage. But I think we definitely should be doing much more of the creative work.
Can I clarify? I didn't mean that the kind of work that you do is not creative, and that therefore you need to go beyond that and do creative work. I think the kind of work that you do, historical work, is crucial, because that kind of historical work can be in a colonial, can be in an Orientalist mode, or it can be in a decolonial mode. So I don't think that doing the kind of stuff that you're doing is. I'm saying that you're an historian.
No, I'm not saying that you were. And in fact, I think history is important. I mean, I always go back to someone who I very much like reading, which is Alistair MacIntyre. And MacIntyre, has a very famous argument in After Virtue about how it is that you cannot possibly understand ethics unless you understand the history of ethics. And I absolutely agree with him. I think that works for all sorts of fields.
You want to give more comments?
Because I think the point you made about history is important. If I take the example of, to illustrate maybe what you were saying, Al-Biruni. I did a bit of work on Al-Biruni on Hinduism. And already there you run into a problem. I first read Al-Biruni in English. The Al-Biruni is India. Kept on coming across the term Hinduism. And then when you read critiques of Orientalist studies on Hinduism, you realize that the idea of Hinduism is a construction, is a colonial Orientalist construction. But yet the translation of Al-Biruni uses the term Hinduism. So I went back to I found the original, and nowhere do you find the term Hinduism. In fact, Al-Biruni was clear in his mind that what he was studying in India were various religions, which later on European scholars, put under one category and named it Hinduism. So that kind of detailed historical study, but conscious of the problem of Orientalism, will yield a different understanding of Al-Biruni. And I think that's part of the creative work that I'm saying we should be doing. But beginning with the text, not talking about how we should talk about Al-Biruni, but actually talk about Al-Biruni. Not talk about how we should revive Ibn Khaldun, but actually do the work and generate some Khaldunian sociology or anthropology, rather than saying we should have a Khaldunian anthropology. That's basically the issue. Yeah.
Okay, right. Thank you, Professor, for the comments and the question. So, any other question? Can pass the mic to the
Thank you very much for your interesting lecture. I just would like to ask...
Can I have your name and from which faculty?
My name is Yusuf, and I'm a PhD student in Usul Fiqh.
All right.
I actually just have two questions. The first question is about the Islamic studies in general, whether it's in Europe, North America, Canada, or Australia even. What do you think the justification when they include Islamic studies under either political science, anthropology, history sometimes, and rarely to find it in a very independent department that really deal with Islamic studies from an Islamic point of view, if I may say? That's my first question. The second question related to the women contribution in Islamic sciences or in Islamic knowledge. Just to comment on Kisha Ali, I think what you just kindly mentioned, the work that's been actually done and still being doing, like for example by Akram Nadwi al-Muhaddithat in Islam, which he mentioned around 8,000 Muslim scholars. And Asma Sayyid, for example, I don't know if anybody is familiar with this name. Asma Sayyid, she has a book. It's called The Role of Women in Transformation or Transmission of Religious Knowledge. I mean, I do understand that in a very sensitive world that we live in now, whenever you mention anything related to men, you should mention something about women, or vice versa. When do you think, or what do you think we should actually do as Muslims in academia to get away from the sensitivity of that topic, forgetting about the gender, and we talk actually how Muslim, whether men or women, contributed to the world civilization? Thank you.
You can use this mic.
So I think on the second point, it's a bit like the different elements of intersectionality, not just gender but also race and so forth. Unfortunately, we haven't got beyond gender in the same way that we haven't got beyond race. So the work we have to do still has to. It's not just a question of sensitivity. It's a question of what is correct and what is right to do, and understanding how it is that the formation of knowledge, attitudes, formation of opinions and so forth is very much comes out of a certain context. So I personally don't think we'll ever get beyond these sorts of issues. I have big issues with this because when I look at the philosophical tradition, which I primarily work on, the philosophical tradition is deeply misogynistic. And so the question I have sometimes is, what is the reason for that? Is the reason for the misogyny the Greek heritage, or is the reason for that misogyny an element of the Islamic heritage that has been developed? And actually what's clear is it's both. It's both. It's kind of a double whammy. So when you look at someone like Mullah Sadra, or where you look at Sabzawari in the 19th century, he has this famous thing where he rather strangely argues that women really don't have a soul, which reminds me of some medieval Christian thinkers who said the same thing, and it's utterly absurd to make that sort of claim. There are other sorts of things he says about women as well. So we kind of have to engage with that, and then in some ways when one's dealing with those sorts of thinkers, it's a bit like the Heidegger problem, right? You think that, yes, this is an individual who has contributions to thought, but you cannot bracket the fact that he's a Nazi, right? So similarly, you kind of cannot bracket the fact that this is a thinker who is a misogynist, and that goes, of course, for even more for many of the classical fuqaha and the people who are involved in law and legal theory and hadith and so forth. I think the work that Akram Nadwi and others do is very important, but at one level it sounds like, it does feel a bit like kind of tokenism. That, it's not, if it was much more extensive than that, then why are we not really rethinking and writing law and looking at how hadith is constructed and transmitted in a different way? I don't think we're doing that yet. So I think the feminist critique of people like Kisha Ali still works. And the political context, I think, is a problematic one. If you look at Sherman Jackson's response to Kisha, and you look at some of the debates around that, it's getting a bit absurd, because at some level they have much more in common. But at one level, there is a sense in which people like Sherman Jackson are just not listening to what she's saying. On your prior point, I kind of agree with you in the sense that one finds people who are described as lecturers or professors of Islamic studies who basically are political science people. And you kind of wonder what's going on here, because they're not really studying Islamic studies in the way we might see it. But they're looking purely at the political side. I mean, for example, I know someone who's just recently been appointed as a professor of Islamic studies at Edinburgh, whose whole career has basically been studying modern Islamisms. And this is not someone who studies or even knows very much about what we might call Islam as religion. So at one level, one of the binaries, which I was talking about earlier, can be expressed as the difference between people who study Islam as religion and those who study Islam as identity, or those who study Islam as different relations in social structures. That is there, but if one's going to do something which is another critique, which Professor Farid mentioned, which I was thinking about other critiques, is what's being called critical Muslim studies. So critical Muslim studies is basically how it is that you can, of course, rethink the sort of study of Islam and religion, but also within the social studies context in a more radically deconstructive manner. And say, how it is that the categories of Islam and Muslim, etc., are constructed. And then how we look at it in a much more critical manner. And some of it can be using Ibn Khaldun, some of it can be using Al-Biruni, some of it can be using Avicenna or whatever, to do that, and putting them into dialogue with the sort of critical dethroning of master narratives that you have in people like Derrida, people like Levinas and so forth in contemporary thought as well. So I think that binary is there. And as I said, when I presented it, it was like study of religion and social science, study of Islam. And I think that is very much there. And of course, you have Muslim academics involved in both, as well as having other academics. I think one of the issues, and this comes back to the earlier point also about Islamization, is when we look at some of these concepts, let's take something like Islamic law or even Islamic philosophy, right? So we use these terms. Do we find that term in the text that we're looking at? Of course we don't. Because when someone says hikmah, they mean hikmah. They're not saying al-hikmah al-islamiyah. They're saying hikmah. The same thing goes with fiqh or sharia. They're saying sharia. They're not saying sharia islamiyah. So there's a way in which we're trying to give this Islamic label, this adjective to these sorts of things, because, in a sense, we've been marginalized to those traditions. So we've been marginalized to the humanities, we've been marginalized to philosophy, we've been marginalized to law, we've been marginalized to all sorts of things. And so we have to introduce this term, or sociology, or anthropology, or whatever. We have to introduce the Islamic label to justify how we input things. That's a problem. I am, for example, interested in how you move towards a global philosophy, and thinking in terms of philosophy beyond the narrow Anglo-American analytic, post-analytic tradition, right? So one of the things that one has to think about is, okay, so what do we mean by philosophy in these different contexts? Does it work across different contexts? Is there a universal thing that we call philosophy? And if there is a universal thing that we call philosophy which has certain features, then we should find it in lots of different contexts, and then we should put those different contexts in conversation with each other to try and produce something which is creative and new. A lot of philosophy departments are increasingly concerned about this, and this is why there was a wonderful, what's the book? Brian Van Norden, I can't remember what the book's called again. It started as an opinion piece in the New York Times, which was all about how the Anglo-American analytic tradition is too narrow in the way it defines philosophy. So it tends to look at just what they do as philosophy, and everything else is basically either literature or what they call wisdom traditions. And one of the things he says, well, this is one way of delegitimizing and disempowering someone, because we have university departments of philosophy, we do not have university departments of wisdom traditions, right? So if you define something as a wisdom tradition, you're basically saying it has no place in a university. So what we need to actually do is, if you're going to do philosophy serious, you need to be familiar with at least 2 or possibly 3 different traditions of philosophy, and then use that to train students in a creative manner. And so you have departments like Leiden has a new degree in global philosophy, SOAS has a new degree in global philosophy, increasingly departments in the US are interested in this. And of course that is raising tensions, and there are some people in the traditional and analytic field who are deeply annoyed at that. I have one of my former students and a friend who I'm very proud that he has a job in the philosophy department. He has lots of issues because he does, what he describes as Islamic philosophy. And his head of department, who is a traditional British analytic philosopher, doesn't really think that someone who works in Islamic philosophy should be in the philosophy department, right? So this is where power differentials matter. Do the students care? No, the students are interested in the question of what philosophy is, and they will engage with whoever is a good and effective teacher. So I think, I've gone on for way too long, but just to reiterate what I said earlier, the study of Islam has to be based within this wider conception of what we understand as a humanity. And for that, I think, we're using this label Islamic humanities, but wouldn't it be great if we actually had departments or even programs which are called Islamic humanities? I think that would be a good place to start, or at least have maybe a column in something which describes itself as an Islamic university, which is called Islamic humanities. I think that would be a desirable thing.
Second question.
I think I mentioned it earlier, yeah.
Yeah, Prof, can you give the...
Okay. So I'm Azila from the International Islamic University Malaysia. So thank you for your presentation just now. Okay, so my question is about, because I noticed that you're coming from the University of Exeter. Okay. So you are the director for the Islamic studies over there. Okay, so I would like for you to share with us how the Islamic studies been conducted there, and then how the contemporary conventional matters been addressed in your curriculum, and more importantly about the Islamization of human knowledge in your university, how the program and the curriculum been conducted there. Thank you.
On the last point, it's very simple. It isn't, because that's not what we're kind of commissioned to do. So how does it affect the way we teach? A simple example, we have our biggest class is probably Introduction to Islam in the first year. And what we do is we have different colleagues who contribute to that. Everyone does their specialization. So there are Muslim colleagues, there are non-Muslim colleagues involved in that. And what we're trying to do is make the students think about what sort of challenges there are in terms of how people study Islam in the contemporary world, sort of political questions of context and so forth, sources, how do you approach it? And also looking at the diversities and richness of the Islamic traditions themselves. So the readings, of course, are Muslims and non-Muslims. The readings are classical and contemporary. The readings are historical and normative across the board. We look at philosophy. We look at theology. Within that module, I teach 2 classes. One class I teach is on the nature of ritual and practice in Islam, and the other one is on the nature of philosophy and theology. And so what I do is I start off by asking the questions, what do people understand by the notions of philosophy and theology? And once we have a sense of what that is, what could that mean within Islamic contexts? And what sort of different disciplines and humanities within Islam then render that within the intellectual traditions? And then on questions of ritual and practice, this is traditionally this has been known as the 5 pillars lecture. And I explicitly never mention the 5 pillars. because I think that's such a simplistic way of looking at Islam. So what I do is I say, well, what do we understand by ritual? What is practice? What is the notion of ibadah? And help people think in a much more holistic way in which how it is that practice then embodies and expresses beliefs and faith. What that relationship is, what is the meaning of it. And so for that class, what I often do is I give them passages from very famous texts by Ghazali and Ibn Arabi, etc., on what does prayer mean? What does fasting mean? So that it kind of connects people with what they're doing, with what it means, with the fact that worship is a connection between a sort of set of horizontal connections between humans and also vertical connections with God. So the students seem to think that's a good way of doing it. They respond quite well. So it's not just a straightforward... I remember when I was an undergraduate, I never went to the lectures because I was a historian, but I know the way Introduction to Islam was taught, or Introduction to what they called Introduction to Islamic Religion was taught at Oxford, and it was basically a straightforward historical class where it said, this is the late antique context, then you've got this thing called the Quran, and then you've got the thing called, this person called Muhammad, and we're not really sure about some of the historicities of these things, and then you get this thing called law, and you get this thing called hadith, and so forth. And within that, you don't really discuss what people actually do. You don't actually discuss, how anything develops beyond the 9th century. You don't discuss philosophy, you don't discuss literature, you don't discuss theology, you don't discuss metaphysics, mysticism, etc., etc., etc. So that's one example, and then we do lots of other things. We have classes on Islamic law, which it's called Islamic law and society. So it's not just a theoretical consideration of what law is in Islam, but also then how it's practiced, what it means for people. We look at fatwas, we look at what the notion of ifta is, we look at questions of how law and ethics works and so forth, and then particular applied cases. I do a class on Islamic theological traditions where we look at problems. So we start off by looking at what the sources of theology are, both scriptural and rational, and then we look at particular types of questions. So we look at particular debates which are both historical and contemporary. So one of the classic questions in classical kalam is, can God lie? Right? Can God lie is a very important question which you can even ask now. And there are ways in which you can resolve it, and there are ways in which you move beyond that now. There are fundamental questions about human responsibility and agency. You have issues about how you deal with authority, how you make sense of prophecy, revelation. There are lots of things. So it's about bringing different types of approaches together and equipping students with different ways in which they can engage with questions. It's really about the questions.
Means that from your explanation, it means that the Islamization of knowledge happened there indirectly when in class, when you teach the student, you incorporated the contemporary conventional methods indirectly into your courses. Is that like that? During the teaching, delivery of the teaching. Is that what you mean from your explanation?
Yeah, well, in the sense that as I said, I try to use different types of sources and engage with different things. And people need to realize that, for Muslims, these are live issues. These are not just historical issues. The status of the Quran is not just a historical issue. The status of the Prophet is not just a historical issue, and so forth. So philosophy is not just a historical artifact which goes back to Avicenna. These things are live, and there are Muslims still engaged with that. And I think the students like to understand that. And certainly for students who are coming from, say, the theology department, we have a lot of students who come from the theology department. For them, that makes sense, because what they do in theology is very much about contemporary stuff. It's not just looking, for example, at Christianity in a historical sense. It's looking at what Christianity is today. So in the same way, when we're teaching the study of Islam, we shouldn't just be looking at it as a historical set of practices and beliefs and truth claims, but also what it is today and how people make sense of it today. But I wouldn't call that Islamization of knowledge. I have intellectual issues, which I don't want to go into right now.
Okay, thank you.
My name is Sajjad. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. I'm not from this area, so I wonder when you say your critique number 2, which is lack of theory, can you please give example of that, and can you suggest why lack of theory in this in your critique number 2? Can you please elaborate on that matter?
Aaron Hughes, yeah. It's not what I'm saying, it's what Aaron Hughes is saying, which is basically that the study of Islam has been insufficiently theorized. So what he means is that people, in a sense, don't really reflect enough on the methodologies that they're using. One of the things which is often said, which characterizes the difference between the study of Islam, say, in a NELC or Middle East Studies department and a religion department, is the religion department, they're like obsessed with theory and with theoretical frameworks. In the NELC department, people just do what they do. And when they're asked what their method is, they usually say something like, well, I go to the library and I read some books and I write, which is a very explicit disavowal of a theoretical approach. I think all he's saying, which I think is somewhat unfair, is that people who work in the field are not self-reflective enough about what they're doing. I think in practice, increasingly people are. As I said, we bring this into, even when we teach Intro to Islam in the first year, the first lecture is all about the sorts of questions which arise when we study Islam in the contemporary world, in the contemporary moment. So I think it may be the case that we haven't written up elaborate kind of schemes about how that actually works, and how that could act as a sort of a blueprint for how you do things. But in practice, we do quite a lot of that theorizing, and we do quite a lot of that contextualizing and that consideration of methodology and how you study things in the way in which it's taught. One of the when that debate between Omid Safi and Aaron Hughes was going on, and also when Shahab Ahmed's book came out, I remember speaking to a friend of mine, Vernon Shubel. Vernon is an anthropologist of Islam, and he said that he's close to retirement, and he said that this was quite amusing because he felt that this was a debate that anthropologists had like decades ago, and they'd, in a sense, already considered that the narrow confines of textual reductionism and this debate between theory and non-theory, they'd done this like 30 years ago, and he was kind of amused by this, what was going on. And certainly a lot of anthropologists I know who work in the field just don't understand why this is suddenly becoming such a debate when, and they kind of say things like, why don't these guys actually read anything we write? It might actually help them. So part of it could also be the way in which different kinds of disciplines relate to each other and linked up. But yeah, all I was trying to do in that slide was basically present what Aaron Hughes is trying to say.
Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Sharifa. I'm from Department of Siyasat Sharia, Academy of Islamic Studies, University of Malaya. Thank you very much for interesting discussion and ideas. I think at the end of this discussion, what I have in my mind is probably you can share the outcome of the whole ideas that you present. Try to envisage the feature of the output, the end output of this product, taking into all these ingredients, the pretext, the text, the context, the critics, as well as the approaches. What is the extra strength that we might produce with these Islamic studies that, that you are sharing with us, especially in facing this global world and digital world, and especially after the 11 September attack, for example, and now with this digital world. So what will be the extra strength for the extra miles for the students especially, and we as the lecturers? Thank you so much.
That's an extremely good question. and I'm not sure I actually have an answer to that. I think what I will say is that it's then maybe useful to look at, what I would consider to be good practice and good works which have come out recently, which I think really try to explain and suggest exciting new ways of doing things. There are plenty of that. There are new works which have come out in Islamic law which do that. There's certainly philosophy. One of my colleagues, people have a lot of criticism of what he does, but he has a very well-known blog which is called The History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps. And he looks at the whole history of philosophy, but he also has about 50-odd episodes, about 70 episodes on the history of Islamic philosophy. And one of the things he's doing in that is precisely how you integrate that study within the wider history of philosophy, and also how it is that you consider what he describes, and what I agree with, an expansive sense of philosophy. So philosophy is not just narrowly kind of the Aristotelian tradition, but also, the question is, what do we mean by philosophy? And then if we understand that, then we can look at, elements of, for example, tafsir as being philosophical, or elements certainly of kalam, elements of usul al-fiqh and stuff as philosophical. So it's then a question of seeing what is coming out, which is interesting. Another friend of mine, who's an anthropologist, has written a recent book which is absolutely fascinating, which he calls it's called the Iranian Metaphysicals. And it's basically about everyday practices in Iran, how people consider it, the way in which the sacred and the profane, the way in which the enchanted and disenchanted, the way in which things are sometimes described as religious and not described as religious, and how the world works in a much more complicated manner than we think. In the old days, of course, sociologists said that we had you have tradition and then you have modernity, and once you have modernity, kind of tradition passes by, and then you have this problem of what do you do with tradition? How do you make sense of it? How do you move from this enchanted to a disenchanted world? And of course, in practice, things work in a much messier manner. So you have, the interest in magic and the occult, the interest alongside science, alongside religion, alongside all sorts of things. And these are all sorts of different ways in which people's lives are informed and made sense of. So I think that's an absolutely fascinating book. It's a disturbing book for many people as well, because the book starts with an exorcism. It's like absolutely fascinating to read. And he's an anthropologist at Chicago Divinity School. But there are many other kind of examples of works which are, presenting and doing much more creative things in the study of Islam. I think some of them are a bit too gimmicky. So there's a recent book on Islamic law which talks about how you, I think he calls it hacking Islamic law. It's deeply problematic because the person really doesn't understand how methodology works in Islamic law. He's, trying to locate it within an idiom which compares it to, say, how the internet works. It doesn't necessarily work, but in some ways it's interesting that he's doing that. So it's really looking beyond into then how it is that people are writing and producing things. And in many ways, I think the field is at an exciting moment. There are lots of kind of young academics coming through who are doing really good work in different areas, and they need to be kind of encouraged, and they should not be told, I think, that they have to do this or that or the other. I think one of the other problems we have in the field is there's an older generation of academics, whether they're in the history of religions mold, or whether they're in the religious studies mold, or the NELC mold. And some of these people can be very prescriptive. They'll insist their students work on this or that. And I don't think that's helpful. I think students need to work through the questions that they're interested in. And then they need to be guided and helped to produce something which is coherent, which is, makes a contribution within that context. But thank you for your question.
Okay, I think will be no more question, right? Okay. Yeah. Okay, I think we'll end our lecture for today, our program for today. So before we end it, I would like to invite Deputy Director Research and Development, Associate Professor Dr. Muhammad Roslan Muhammad Nur to deliver token of appreciation to our speaker for today. Please, tarik gambar. Okay, right. Thank you very much for our speakers and to all who came for talk for today. Before that, I would like to invite all of everyone to have some kind of refreshment outside. Please, all are invited. Okay, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi taala wabarakatuh.
Can we have a group photo? Can we have a group photo with Prof. Sajjad here? Here. Just here. Just in front here. Yeah. Everyone can come in front to take a photo with him. And then after photo, we can go to have, inshallah, to have lunch together.